Release the Kraken!
Greetings, fellow game designers. Ron here at Lame Duck Studios, and today we're going to go ahead and create a clone of Missile Command. Now, here are some various incarnations of it. This is one of the earlier arcade versions, and you can see other folks have done their own variations of them, yada yada yada. We're going to go ahead and do this one in Unity. If you'd like to see it done in Unreal 4 or Unreal 5, just let me know, and I'll go ahead and do it. But today we're going to tackle it in Unity, and we're actually going to do something a little bit different. Normally I build all the assets first and show you how the assets are built, and then we bring them into the game engine. This time we're going to go ahead and build the core of the game first using stand-in pieces, and then we're going to go ahead and do the assets later. That way, if you have your own assets or you want to build them on your own, you're welcome to. You can just swap them out. So without further ado, let's go ahead and open up Unity. Go ahead and add a new project here. And if you want to do it as a 2D project, you are welcome to. I'm going to do this as a 3D project because most of them are already done in 2D, so there's not really any ground to break there. So to be a little bit different, let's go ahead and do it in 3D. And I'm going to go ahead and name this, I'm not going to name it Missile Command. I'm going to go ahead and name it City Defense. Some copyright handling there. And I'll go ahead and hit Create. And while Unity is booting up, a word from our sponsor, which is me. If you'd like to support the channel, consider checking out some of my books. I have a bookstore, that's brucebooks.com. Also, my uncle wrote a book. That's always pretty neat. His is currently free on Kindle, I think. You can see some of my books here. I also have a Patreon. Donations are always awesome. You can always become a supporter or whatnot. And of course, you can check out my Rarible page and look at some of the NFTs. Little Rex is pretty popular here, and today is May the 4th. So at the time of this recording, it is May the 4th, and May the 4th be with you. Little Rex here has the little lightsaber. Tomorrow is Revenge of the 5th, so if you're interested in that sort of thing, check them out. Any support helps with the channel. It helps me do the things that I love, so thank you, appreciate it, and on with the show. All right, so here we are inside of Unity. And it doesn't really matter what version you're in. I'm in 20.3. People always ask, what version should I use? Just use the latest LTS version. It's fine. But anyway, and the first thing I want to build is our building. So I'm going to go ahead and right-click up here into our hierarchy view. And I'm going to come down and do a Create Empty. And I'm going to call this Skyscraper. There we go. Hit Enter. Now we have our skyscraper object. You see it appears over here. And inside here, I'm just going to go ahead and create another object. Right-click on that. Come down to 3D object and create a cube. And there we go. We have our first building. Woo! Now having a single building is great, but we want to have a whole bunch of buildings. And we want to be able to reuse this. So right now in my hierarchy, it's there and I can talk to it. Let's say I make another level. Then I'd have to make my building again, which I don't want to do. So I'm going to make this into a prefab. Prefab's really handy. I can store them down here in my assets, and I can just call them in code whenever I want them. To make a prefab, it's pretty simple. All you got to do is right-click in your projects and go to Create and then to Prefab, or you can just take the object you've already made and drag it into your project view. Well, bam, and there it is. It's already made into a prefab. And check it out. There's my skyscraper. And you can see that it has turned blue. This lets us know that it is a prefab. And if I want to make changes to it, I can, but here's the thing. If you make changes to the one in your scene, you're only modifying that version. If you want to make real changes, you want to make it on the prefab itself. So any further updates to this object should be done inside of our assets here. So I'm going to go ahead and just double-click on this. That's going to bring us into our prefab editor. It looks very much the same. We're inside our hierarchy, but you can see right here we are inside our skyscraper. And there's a little back arrow that lets us get out if we want to. So I'll jump back in. And now I can make changes to this. First thing I want to do is make sure that our building is building sized. So how tall is our skyscraper? Well, that's probably not very good. Let's go ahead and make it a little bit taller. Now, keep in mind the object you have selected. If you have the parent object and you make changes on the parent, those are going to be here, and it's going to affect all of the children. If you make changes on the child object, it'll only affect the child, and the parent will remain the same. Okay? Children follow the parent doesn't have to follow the child. we're going to make our changes on the cube. So I'm going to come down to my cube here, make sure we have that, and make my changes in here. So I'm going to go ahead and adjust my height. I'm going to do 3 times in the height. So it's going to be scale Y, and you can see that my green arrow points up. That's my Y arrow. So 3. Well, bam. But here's the problem. Now that I have the correct height, I'm halfway through the ground. So, not too big of a deal. We just move ourselves halfway out of the ground. So I'm going to come to my position, and I'm going to go down to my Y position here. And I'm going to do that halfway through our height, which is half of 3, 1.5. So 1.5. Woo. And there we go. So now we are halfway out of the ground. And if we go to our skyscraper, you can see the pivot is now positioned on the floor, and the scale of our prefab of our skyscraper is 111, and our position is 0. Now this is important because in the world we want to make sure that our 0 position is with the ground, which is why we did our changes on our cube and not the parent. So I'm going to go ahead and exit my prefab, and you can see here we are. And there it is, and you can see that it is on the ground, which is awesome. And here's the even better part. I can take my prefab and just drag it in. And if I go ahead and hit 0 on my Y there, it'll just bring it up. Next thing I need is, of course, a ground plane, because we need something for our objects to be positioned on. So go ahead in here, I'm going to go ahead and just right-click. I'm going to come down to Create. 3D object. I'm going to make a ground plane. So you can use a plane or you can use a terrain if you like. I'm going to stick with a plane just because I want to keep the video simple. So I hit plane. There it is. I'm going to go ahead and set that to 0, 0, 0. And I will also name it ground. So come up here. Whoops. There we go. Ground. Now look at that. It's perfect. The buildings are standing on it. Amazing. And if I want to make more buildings, I can just move these around. I can use Control-D to duplicate, and suddenly I have another one. Or I can just drag from my projects here, and bam, I can make all the buildings that I want. Amazing. I'm a little bit OCD though. I'm going to reorganize these, so I can make sure these guys are all kind of like in a group here. Carefully don't make things children of other things. I'm going to go ahead and just close the little arrow there. There we go. I'll keep my ground on the bottom. Those are all good. And you see all the skyscrapers, they are copies of each other. Another cool thing about a prefab is if I make a change to a prefab, let me go ahead and just open this real quick. Let's say I want to add another cube here. 3D object, cube. And cool, I'll just leave that one right there. If I come out of the prefab now, they all get this change. So this is why making prefabs is so awesome, because you only have to make one change and they all get it. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and undo that, and we will continue with our project. Okay, so that we have our building set up, we need something to kind of fall and hit our building. So let's go ahead and make our asteroid. I'll go ahead and just right-click in here, come up to Create, and I'll go down to Prefab. This is a different way of making a prefab. I'll go ahead and just call this one Asteroid. So we have our asteroid. I'm going to go ahead and just double-click, and you can see right now there's no object on it. Let's go ahead and just double-click it. That brings us into an empty project view, or empty prefab view. And I'll go ahead and right-click in here. Let's add in our 3D object. Let's go ahead and add in a sphere, just to be different. And if I select it and press the F key, it'll frame up. So here's our sphere, and we have our sphere and our asteroid. Now, for our asteroid to kind of fall out of the sky, we need to set up a rigid body. Now the question is, where do we put the rigid body? Well, it actually needs to go on the parent object, which is our asteroid. We don't want it to go on the child. And the reason is, if you put it on the child, the parent will stay still and the child will fall away from the parent, which we don't want. We want the parent object to be the one moving. So I'm going to go to the parent, which is our asteroid, then add component, and add a rigid body. There it is. Cool. And if I put this into the world, here we are, and I hit play, it should do some falling. And it probably did, I just can't see where it went. Here, I'll move it high. There it goes, it did some falling. Awesome. Go back into our asteroid. One other quick change I want to make has to deal with the collision. Right now, the collision of our object, and we're going to see this a little bit more as we start programming, the collision is on the child. If I go ahead and grab, you can see the asteroid here. It has no collision, but the sphere has the collision. Now the problem with it being on the child object is they don't communicate collision back to the parent. So if we write any code, we have to write the code and communicate to the child and back to the parent and back and forth. To solve that problem and to save us on time and the amount of work we have to do to communicate between objects, we're just going to remove our sphere collider. So remove. And then we're going to go ahead and add that back to the asteroid. So go to the asteroid, add component, and we will add in our sphere collider. And of course, our size should be the same, which it is because it's just the default. I will go ahead and move our sphere collider up just because I like my collisions to be above my other stuff. It's a preference. It doesn't really matter. And this will functionally work the same. If I go ahead and back out and hit play, it'll fall and it'll hit stuff. Hey, it works. The difference is now the collision's on the parent. If I change out the asteroid with our object we're going to make later, we don't have to really worry too much about setting up the collision as much, and it should still pretty much work. The other thing is we don't have to talk to the child anymore to get the collision data. That's all on the parent. So we're kind of saving ourselves some time there. Go ahead and back out of there. So now we have a couple objects. We can start writing some code. So I'm going to come down here, and actually we should organize stuff, right? Because we have a bunch of prefabs everywhere. Let's go ahead and do that. We're in our assets folder. Let's make a new one. Create folder. Call this Prefabs. Cool. And I'll just grab these. Shift click to grab them both and just drag them in. Awesome. They're inside there. And then back in our assets folder, let's go ahead and make a new folder. This one's going to be for our scripts. So folder, call this scripts. And then inside of our scripts folder, we will make our first script. So create script. And this is going to be our spawner. So go ahead and just make that. And we're going to use this to spawn the asteroid. So I'm going to come up to here, right click, come down to create empty. And this is going to be spawner. And I'm going to drag my spawner code to my spawner. Hey, there it is. Okay, let's go ahead and just open this up inside of Visual Studio. There we go. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a reference to our asteroid. So go to the top here, okay, enter. I'm going to do public game object. And this is going to be our enemy prefab. So enemy prefab. Now with this, that's awesome. We're going to go into our start function and use the instantiate function. So instantiate. And the instantiate function asks for a few things. If you hover over with your mouse, you can see that it requires an object to create, a position, which is a vector 3, and the orientation or the rotation of our object. Now you can specify it or you can use a default there. So the first thing I want to put into here is the object. So game object there, that is going to be our enemy prefab. I'm going to separate with that with a comma. And now we need a location for this to spawn into. I'm going to use spawn location. We haven't created it yet. It's a little bit upset about that, but it's all right. I'm going to go ahead and write it, hit comma, and then space. And then the last bit is the orientation or the rotation of it. And this is going to be quaternion identity. There we go. Now, if you have a specific one, you can write it in, but this should get the actual orientation of the prefab itself and drop it in for us. So let's go ahead and make our spawn location. I'll come up to the top here, go ahead and hit enter. Now do a private, and this is going to be a vector 3. And then this is going to be our spawn location, and then semicolon. So I'm going to come into our start function, hit enter. Make a comment, I'll call this one set spawn location. This is going to be spawn location. I'm going to set that equal to new vector 3. And for now, I'm just going to do 0, 0, 0. Let's make this one 10. We'll do 0, 10, 0. Okay, so it'll set this. And then down here, I'll just comment, this will be spawn enemy prefab. Okay, so if I save this and jump back into Unity, let that compile. Let's go ahead and grab our spawner. You can see that it now asks us for our enemy prefab. It says, who do you want us to spawn? You can spawn whatever you want out of here. I'm going to go ahead and go to my prefabs. I'll just go ahead and drag in my asteroid right there. Then I'll hit play. Now, it doesn't really matter where your spawner is. I can put this spawner way over there. That's fine. And I'll go ahead and get rid of our old asteroid that's in there. Okay. Hit play. And there is the new one. Now, having it to spawn at 0 isn't all that fun. We should actually spawn this in at some location. And having it spawn one at a time isn't that fun either. Let's go ahead and try something else. Let's go ahead and change this. We're going to make this from our start function. We'll just call this one spawn enemy. Here we go. And check this out. If I take my spawn enemy and I write that down in here, spawn enemy, like so. Make sure we get our parentheses on there, our semicolon. Save it. We jump back in now. And we hit play. Well, that's kind of cool. Of course, that's not very fun. We would have lost the game already. But just so you can see, we can get far more stuff out of using our update, because our update happens every tick, whereas our start function only happens at the very beginning of the game. I'll go ahead and leave this here, and then I'm going to wrap this code inside of an if statement, because I don't want to just spray them all willy-nilly. I want them to spray in a specific place at a specific time. So I come up to above this, I do if. I don't know what my if is going to be yet. Hit enter. And then add a set of braces there, hit enter. And I drag the code that is right here, leave this brace, just drag this up in here, and press tab to go over one. And now we can start writing our governing code that tells us when and where we should spawn our stuff. So the when is important. When do we want this to spawn? Every couple of seconds? That sounds pretty good. Let's go ahead and do that. We're going to do this as spawn time. Okay, it's going to be a little bit angry. We haven't told it what to do yet, but spawn time will say less than or equal to 0. Make sure you put these little F's on here. If you don't put the F's on here, then it's going to default to a double, which is bigger than a float. So down here, if I hover over our vector, 3 is 3 floats, it would give us a warning that we are converting a double to a float. So just make sure those are on there. So our spawn time, I'm going to come up, let's make a new variable here. This is going to be private. This is going to be float. And this one's going to be spawn time. Make sure I do that lowercase spawn time. I'll set that to 0. And we need our spawn time to reset whenever it's finished counting down. So we'll set that to a private float. This is going to be our spawn delay. And I don't know how long I want this to be, but I'll go ahead and just do 5, F, with a semicolon. Now, down here, as our code is counting down, if our spawn time is 0, we're going to set a location and then spawn in the object, right? If this is not 0, we want it to count down. So go ahead and hit enter. Now do else, and then enter. And our else is going to handle the counting down portion. So I'm going to say spawn time, oops, spawn time minus equals, that's a shorthand, that means to subtract from this. So subtract from this guy. And we're going to subtract our time dot delta time. Okay. Now we also want our timer to reset. So when do we reset our timer? Well, very simple. Once we hit 0 and we've set our location and we've spawned our object, we should go ahead and hit enter, reset timer. Okay. And this is going to be our spawn time. Come on, you. we'll set that equal to our spawn delay. There we go. Okay, and this is already set inside of our update, which is great. Make sure we save it. And we will test it. And there's one. Give it a few seconds. And there's the next one. And if we waited again, we would have another one. Awesome. Now having them all fall in one straight line is not very fun. It's far too predictable. We're going to make some changes. Jump back into our code here. We're going to make this be a random position. But how do we know what values to set? Well, that comes into knowing the boundaries of where we want this to spawn. So if we look at our platform here, we don't want anything to spawn outside of this. We want them to always being spawned somewhere inside where roughly a building is. We could set up a targeting system, but that's a little bit outside the scope of us. We're going to go ahead and just keep it simple. So we'll use a boundary for our left and right, and our forward and back, and our height. Okay, we'll jump in. We'll come up to the top here, make a couple entries. Let's do public because we want to have access to these outside the code here. And we're going to do public. We'll do a float, and this is going to be bound top. And I don't know what that's going to be yet, so I'll just hit a semicolon. And the next one's going to be public float bound. Let's see, right. Public float bound left. Public float bound front. And then public float bound back. So we have our top boundary, which is not going to change all that much, and we have our left and right boundaries, and then our forward and back boundaries. Okay. I come down into here, and on my new vector 3 for my x position, so we have x, y, and z. For the x, I'm going to do random dot range. Set some parentheses on there. And for this, if we go inside, we need to have a minimum and a maximum. Our minimum is going to be our negative value, and our maximum is going to be our positive value. So left is actually our negative. So we're going to do bound left, comma, bound right. Okay, so we have our bound left and bound right. Okay, and then our y value, that is going to be our bound top. So bound top. Okay, and then for our depth, our forward and back, that's going to be another random dot range. Set some parentheses there. And that's going to be our minimum is going to be our negative. This should be our back. So bound back. And then our bound front. And just for the sake of the video, because this is kind of going off, I'm going to go ahead and just go to our random here just after the comma, hit enter. That's going to wrap it and make it easier for us to see on our screen here. Remember that the line ends at the semicolon. So as far as the computer is concerned, this is one continuous line of code. Okay, let's go ahead and save it. Jump into our program here, let it compile. Grab our spawner. And now you should see that we have some open values. We have our top. I'm going to leave that at 10. And then for our left, right, forward, and back, if we look at our plane here, we have 10 blocks or 10 squares, right? But we start at 0, which means that we have 5 on one side of 0 and 5 on the other. So it's a positive 5 and negative 5. Pretty easy. For our right value, it will be positive 5. Our left value is going to be our negative 5. The front will be positive, and then our back will be negative. And if you're not sure how I derive that, it's actually based on, if I grab my ground plane here, if I look at the direction of the arrow, okay, the arrow is pointing to screen left, okay, but it's actually, if I go this way and orient myself facing down the forward arrow, you can see that it actually points to the right, okay? The arrow is the positive direction, positive direction, positive direction. So the back of the arrow is the negative. And since if we're facing forward, like this, positives on the right, negatives on the left. Forward is positive, backward is negative, up is positive, down is negative. Okay? And if we set those up as they are, and we hit play, we should see that the objects will spawn in at a random location. So there's one, there's another, and another. Yay! So that's working. It's a bit slow. Let's go ahead and just adjust our spawn time here. So let's scroll up, change my spawn. Let's make that 3. And it would be a lot more interesting if more than one spawned at a time. So I'm going to go ahead and just come into our code a little bit. I'll hit enter. I'm going to do a for loop. So for, and I'll leave it empty. Hit enter, and then put some braces on. Hit enter. And I'm going to drag in our spawn prefab and our spawn location. We'll take those into our loop. So drag those up, tab them over. We can leave our spawn time reset outside the loop because that needs to happen after the loop is done. Okay? And what a loop does is it's going to go through and do a thing again and again until it's finished, and then it's going to exit and then continue. So we're going to have this loop through a certain number of enemy prefabs before it's finished. So the loop is going to be int n, and this is just a random number for counting. So we're going to create it inside of here, set that to 0, and then we're going to do n less than spawn rate, and then n plus plus. Now we don't have a spawn rate yet. I'm going to come up to here, and come up to our values up here, and hit enter, and do private. This is going to be an int, and the reason we're going to do an int is we are comparing an integer to an integer. You could compare it to a float, but you might get a loss of data. So we're just going to go ahead and do an int, and I set this to spawn rate. And I don't know what this is going to be yet, so I hit semicolon. I come down here, and just before the loop, I do set spawn rate. I do spawn rate is equal to random.range. And the range is going to be between 1 and however many we want to spawn. So 1, comma, and then 5. Sure. So anywhere between 1 and 5. Okay. Now I'm not going to put the little f's on here, just because that this function is designed to figure out an auto type, and you can see here that if it's looking for an integer, it is going to be filling in for an integer, right? Whereas down here we're looking for a float. It auto-filled for a float for us. So this will auto-find. Okay. So don't let yourself be confused by that. These are left off because that's an int. So that should set this and reset those values. And let's play it. There we go. Sometimes it drops a few. Sometimes it drops a couple. Okay, so now we have our stuff falling into our world, but it would be nice if we could destroy the buildings. So let's go ahead and set up a behavior for that. So inside of our scripts here, I'm going to right-click, create C# script. I'm going to call this one building, or buildings, if you like. There's our building, so we go ahead and open that up. Inside here, we're going to set up a pretty simple scenario. So I'm going to come down to our start function. I'm going to go ahead and change this to on collision. Enter. Let's go ahead and turn blue. And in here, we want to look for a collision. And then collision. So this turn blue, that means it's a built-in function. And this is a special type of function. It's called an event listener. So what it does is it waits for something to happen. In this case, it's looking for an overlap of two things to intersect. And if they do, once this happens, it's going to trigger the code inside. In this case, we just want our building to disappear. So I'm going to call our destroy function. So destroy And the thing we want to destroy is this dot game object. So this keyword here literally means this piece of code, or this body of code here. All right, go ahead and just save that there. We'll jump back into our code here, let that compile. And we need to add that code to our prefab. So to go to our prefab, open up our building, and inside of here, we want to add, go down to our scripts, we're going to add the building script to our skyscraper. Make sure it's on the skyscraper parent, not the child. And you can see there's our building. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and hit play and see what happens. Oh no, they didn't disappear. But why? Ah, if anybody's been paying attention, you remember I said in the very beginning that the child object, in this case, our child object has the collision, and it's not communicating back to the parent. So the way to get around that is write a separate piece of code that communicates between the two objects, or remove it from your child object and add it back to the parent. So I'm going to go to the parent, and we'll add the collision here. So this is going to be a box collider. There's our box collider. Now our box collider is a bit tiny and in the wrong space. It's fine. We can just set it to match our building. So our building will come down to the size of our collider here. So size, which is the same as our scale, is going to be 3 tall. And then for the center, we want to set the center of the widget here to be half the height, so 1.5. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. And now if I hit play, we should see the asteroid destroying buildings. Awesome. Oh, they're all gone. That would be kind of fun if I could, click on the asteroid and keep them from destroying my buildings. So let's go ahead and exit. I'll jump out of this one. Let's jump back into our scripts. We're going to make an asteroid code here. So script, call that one asteroid. And we'll open that up. 2 things to the asteroid. One is the collision whenever we click on it. And the other one is whenever it falls out of the screen, we should get rid of it. Okay, so I'm going to change the start function here to on mouse down. And what this is another one of those built-in handlers, built-in listener events. What this does is it waits, if you read the little caption here, on mouse down is called when a user has pressed the mouse button while over the collider. In this case, you can use a GUI object or the collider. So if you're inside of any of those events, it'll read it as a collision and return. So in our case, once we click, if we're hovering over our asteroid, we want the asteroid to disappear. I'm going to say destroy, and you guessed it. Which object do we want to destroy? This .game object. Yay! Awesome. And if we save that and play it, okay, make sure that we put our code on our asteroid prefab. Go ahead and open that up. Again, we want this to be on the parent, so go ahead and grab my scripts, drag my asteroid code to my asteroid. Again, make sure it's on the parent. Jump back, hit play. And if I click on an asteroid, I can get rid of them. They do fall a little bit too quick for me to do anything about. You can see if I click on buildings, nothing happens. And exit there. A couple things. I want to fix the camera, so go ahead and grab the camera here. I'm going to look in my down window here. I'm going to move the camera up into position until the ground is level-ish with the bottom of the screen there. Awesome. That'll give me a little bit more time to react. And if I go to my asteroid prefab here, let's add some drag. So I'll put the drag, I'll do 0.1 on the drag. That'll slow it down as it's falling. Still a bit too quick, but I can interact with it. I'll let you guys set that to however you like. Okay. And then lastly, I want to, for the sake of this video anyway, I want to make sure that the asteroids, when they fall off the screen, that they are destroyed. Because at some point, we'll end up having so many of them still alive in space out there that we'll slow down the game or we'll crash it. So we want to make sure that we clean these up once they've fallen off the platform. So I'll jump back into our code here, and we will set a new function. So I'll do void. This is going to be check boundary. And you see that this one's yellow because it's a custom function that we are writing. And very simply, you just want to make sure that if our object is outside of the world, destroy it. So if transform dot position dot y. So if our transform, which is our default, if I go to our object here, the transform is the default widget on the object that determines its position. So if that is lower than our screen boundary, so in this case we'll say less than or equal to, we'll say bound bottom. Because we haven't really determined it yet, it's going to be a little bit mad, but it's okay. We'll hit enter. And we'll say destroy this game object. We want to call the boundary inside of our updates. So check boundary. We also need to set this value, so I'll scroll up just before our mouse event. I'm going to do a private, and then let's do float bound bottom, and we'll set this to, what's a good value off screen? Maybe -10 off screen. So we'll save it, and let's jump back into the game here. I'm going to move the platform out of the way just so I can see it. So we're going to go ahead and hit play. And as these fall, we can see these clones, and there they go. There they are. They spawned in, and boom, they disappeared. Spawn in, and boom. So they're far enough off screen I don't see them, because we don't want the player to see those blinking out, you know. And that works. We'll go ahead and set this back to 0 here. Grab the platform. Okay, and I think for the sake of this video, we will call it here. And in the next few, we're going to go ahead and build our assets, and we'll come back and do some final steps like adding in the text on the screen for our score and a start button and all that stuff. So stay tuned. I hope you enjoyed it, and I shall see you next time. Oh, and if you want to see this done in Unreal, make sure you let me know in the comments. Hey guys, thanks for checking out my channel. Misty and I both thank you. If you enjoyed that video just watched, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe. Also, we're at 1,400 subscribers. Woo! If you have any suggestions for future videos, go ahead and leave them down in the comments. And if you want to keep up with me on Twitter, it's BruceRF1. That's also in the description. And if you want to support the channel, make it easier for me to make content for you, check out some of my merch or one of my books. But yeah, all that, again, is in the description. Check it out, and I shall see you next time.